Well, today our lesson is an introduction and a cursory look at the book of Acts. The fifth New Testament book in our English Bible order is called the Acts of the Apostles. But the correct title should actually be the Acts of the Holy Spirit, because when you read the book of Acts, you will find that the Holy Spirit is the main character who's guiding all the lives of the people. The book of Acts is written by Luke, the beloved physician, who wrote twin volumes, the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. And each work covers about 30 years. The Gospel starts with the birth of Christ and ends in Jerusalem. The book of Acts starts with Jerusalem and ends in Rome. So you get a movement from Bethlehem to Jerusalem in one of Luke's writing, and from Jerusalem to Rome in the other of his two-part series. Acts 17:6 describes the heroes of the book of Acts as these who turned the world upside down. So if you would look at the book of Acts, you'll find that through the power of the Holy Spirit, a life-changing, world-changing activity began in Jerusalem. When Jesus first returned to heaven, he had spent 40 days appearing to those whom he knew on earth, and as many as 500 at one time. And then when the disciples were waiting, he ascended into heaven, and he said, now wait and stay together until the Holy Spirit comes. And in just a few days, the Holy Spirit's power, like tongues of fire, came on all the disciples, and they began to share the good news that Jesus told them to in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So you'll notice that the text does not say, if the Holy Spirit comes on you. It says, when the Holy Spirit comes on you. Don't miss this. The Holy Spirit comes on every believer. He becomes the one who resides in the believer and who provides the power for witness. There's a distinct movement of what Jesus tells us about in Luke's emphasis on what happens when the Holy Spirit guides us. He said, the former treatise, O Theophilus, that means God loved. I don't think it was a single man to whom Luke wrote the book of Acts. But he now says their agenda, the disciples' agenda, was kingdom restoration. They wanted Jesus to come back, set up a kingdom. That was not Jesus' plan. He wanted to give them the Holy Spirit, and that Holy Spirit would give them a movement from fear to faith by the resurrection of Jesus, and from the personal agenda of kingdom restoration to now the promise of passion in reaching others. So when you see the Holy Spirit's power coming upon them, you move from the promise of power to the passion of witness. And we're now ambassadors for Christ, proclaiming the good news to turn our world upside down as we go and share the message of Christ's love. And this invitation marks the church. Acts 1:21 said, whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Romans 10:13 repeats the message. Whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. That's the message you and I share with the world around us. Now, let's look at this narrative, which is what Acts is all about, and we'll see that Peter's leadership is the key role in the early chapters of Acts. Chapters 8 and 9 introduce Saul, who becomes the Apostle Paul. And even though the disciples chose Matthias to take the place of Judas, it's obvious that God chose Paul to be the one who became the fulfillment of that role with the apostles. Eventually, Peter, in the 10th chapter of Acts, learns that the Gentiles may receive the Holy Spirit. But during this whole initial phase, from chapter 11, from chapter 1 through chapter 11, you have a time of persecution. And that persecution drove the disciples out of Jerusalem and to share with others in the world around them. So that led to the first council of churches, or the council of the church, in Acts 15, where the major decision they had to make was, what do we do with these Gentiles? We understand what the message is to the Jews, but how do we handle Gentiles? And when you read Acts 15, you realize that they got the word from the Holy Spirit that they were to accept the Gentiles, and they were also part of the church of Jesus Christ. Paul and Barnabas are now commissioned as the first missionaries. John Mark, you remember, who wrote the Gospel of Mark, was really Peter's gospel, as he wrote down what Peter had told him. And Barnabas took John Mark with them. But when Paul decided Mark had failed and was going to go back to Jerusalem, he and Barnabas had a disagreement. And Paul chose Silas to be his missionary companion, and Mark became the companion of Barnabas. Not all disagreements in the church are necessarily bad. When Paul and Barnabas had a disagreement, or when Paul and Peter had a disagreement, what came out of that was a resolution that was beneficial under the guidance of the Holy Spirit to the church. I wish I could say that every disagreement in the churches that we know today was under the guidance of the Holy Spirit and brought about a good thing for the people, but that's far from the case sometimes when we're divided over issues that may not be nearly as important. When Paul went on to minister further to the churches and establish those churches in the 16th chapter of Acts, the verbiage changes from they, as Luke describes the narrative, to we. And so when you recognize in the 10th verse of the 16th chapter of 16th chapter of Acts, Luke joins with Paul, and he becomes his companion all the way through to the time in Rome when Paul is eventually executed. Acts is a book that is a narrative, and so you're going to see things moving from city to city, and we'll look at those for just a moment. Now, when Luke joins them, Paul is going to move on to Europe, and Lydia, who is a gracious hostess in the city of Thyatira, is now the first European convert. She's baptized, and Paul and others use her house as a kind of jumping off place to move on to other cities. The next stop was Philippi, which was a provincial city named after stop for a second. Philippi was a city named for Philip, the father of Alexander the Great. So it was one of the Roman provincial cities, a special city. And Paul and Silas began to preach the gospel there. They were thrown into jail. And one of the interesting stories from Philippi is that Paul and Silas sang hymns at night, and an earthquake came, opened up the jail, but none of the prisoners escaped. And so Paul and Silas were taken care of by the jailer, and then eventually the townspeople wanted to send Paul and Silas away, but Paul, as a Roman citizen, demanded that they should apologize. We need to learn some lessons about how to handle our faith in front of the government authorities of our lives, and not just to wimp away from some of the accusations and some of the treatment that is received by the church. Paul goes on to talk about the new churches in Thessalonica, in Berea, and in Athens, where he gives a great sermon. Then Priscilla and Aquila and Apollos are becoming part of his ministry team. And the next church is the church at Ephesus, where Timothy is going to be installed as the pastor. But there's, again, this turning the world upside down theme, because Diana of the Ephesians was not only a temple prostitution center, but it was the home of the silversmiths who made their livelihood and their fortunes by making icons of those who came to worship in the temple of Diana. Eventually, when this uproar took place, Paul was sent out of the city by his friends so that he wouldn't be killed, and he decided to go to Jerusalem. There, he was arrested, and for a couple of years under Felix, Festus, and King Agrippa, he was held in house arrest and shared the gospel with the Roman appointees who came to be part of the Roman dominance of Israel at that time. And eventually, Paul could not go back to Jerusalem, so he had to appeal his Roman citizenship. And when he did, Agrippa sent him under his direction to Rome, where he could appear before Caesar. And the rest of the book of Acts primarily has to do with the struggle to sail from Caesarea, the coastline of Palestine, and all the way through across the Mediterranean Sea until they finally arrived in Rome. And again, Paul has a period, maybe two periods, of house arrest that take place in Rome sometime before 70 AD. If the city of Jerusalem had been destroyed and word had come to Rome that that was the case, it certainly would have been recorded in the book of Acts, but it wasn't. So we know that it took place sometime prior to 70 AD when the Romans sacked Jerusalem. The narrative of Acts introduces us then to the letters that follow from Acts all the way through to the general epistles, the ones not written by Paul. And so you have the letters to the Romans, the Corinthians, the Galatians, the Ephesians, the Philippians, the Colossians, and the Thessalonians, as well as the personal letters he wrote to Timothy on 2 occasions, to Titus, to Philemon, and then the general letter to the Hebrews, which most of us recognize is a Pauline letter written perhaps early during his stay in Jerusalem after coming from the desert and learning what the fulfillment of the covenants were among the Jewish people. So we have this wonderful book that allows us the detail of the incidents. The Gospels are the details, as it were, of the life of Jesus. The book of Acts, the details of the life of the church as the Holy Spirit guides the church out. And then the middle part of the New Testament, from the book of Romans through to the book of Hebrews, you have the theological foundations of the church, and then the general epistles, which would be James, Peter, John, Jude, and finally the book of prophecy, the book of Revelation. What a great book God has given us to guide us in our growth and in our life as believers. I hope you'll join me as we continue to study it together.